The 43rd floor of Hargrove Tower smelled like money. Not literally. It smelled like cold air conditioning, the faint chemical trace of fresh printer ink, and the kind of expensive cologne that men in dark suits wore to remind everyone in the room that they could afford expensive cologne. But Victoria Hale had worked in buildings like this long enough that those smells had become, in her mind, completely inseparable from the concept of wealth itself. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, her back to the room, her reflection ghosted over the gray expanse of Manhattan below. 36 years old, 5'7" of precision, every strand of dark blonde hair pulled back without a single strand out of place. Her charcoal blazer cut so exactly to her shoulders that it looked sculpted rather than sewn. She held a ceramic coffee mug in both hands, not drinking from it, just holding it, a habit. The warmth helped her think. Behind her, the conference room was alive with the controlled energy of people trying very hard to appear calm. Marcus Webb, her chief legal counsel, sat at the far end of the long table, making small, neat notes in the margin of a document with a gold-tipped pen. He was 61 with the papery skin of a man who had spent 4 decades in boardrooms and courtrooms, and he had the specific kind of confidence that came from never once having been proven wrong in a situation that mattered. Across from him sat the representatives of Corvin Capital. 3 men and 1 woman, all of them in their 40s, all of them wearing the same polished expression of careful optimism. Their lead, a man named Elliot Branson, had the build of someone who had played collegiate lacrosse 20 years ago and hadn't quite let go of it. He smiled a great deal. Victoria had learned, over the years, to be deeply suspicious of people who smiled that much. "We're ready when you are, Miss Hale," Marcus said without looking up from his notes. Victoria didn't turn around. "Give me a moment." The room accepted this without complaint. That was one of the privileges of being Victoria Hale. You could ask a room full of people to wait, and they would wait, and they would do it quietly. People had been waiting quietly for Victoria Hale since she was 26 years old and barely had a name to carry into a room. They waited differently now, with more deference, more wariness, a finer-tuned attention to the quality of her silences, but the essential dynamic had been there from the beginning. She had always been the kind of person that rooms rearranged themselves around. She was not vain about this. She understood it as a function of will and preparation rather than personality. You showed up more prepared than anyone else. You anticipated problems 3 moves ahead. You did not let people see when you were uncertain, not because certainty was always warranted, but because uncertainty displayed prematurely became a self-fulfilling erosion. These were the things she had learned, sometimes painfully, in the decades she had spent building a company from a single rented desk in a shared workspace in Brooklyn. That desk had been the size of a dining table leaf. The workspace had smelled like burned coffee and ambition, and the particular desperation of 23 other people also trying to build something from nothing. She had sat there for 14 months before she could afford a real office. 14 months of eating dinner at her desk, because the desk was her office, and her conference room, and her thinking space, and sometimes, late on Friday nights when she was too tired to take the subway home, functionally, her bedroom. She had built Hale Integrated from nothing. That was the word people always used, nothing, as if she had materialized in a blank void and conjured a technology firm out of pure will. The truth was more complicated and less cinematic. She had started with a severance check, a rented desk in a shared workspace in Brooklyn, and a specific, almost obsessive conviction that enterprise data security was being managed catastrophically by every firm in the market. She had been 26. She had worked 16-hour days for 3 years before she hired her first employee. She had eaten a lot of bad takeout and slept badly and called her mother on Sunday evenings and not mentioned any of the terror. Now Hale Integrated was valued at $480 million, and Corvin Capital wanted to acquire a 40% stake. This specific deal, on this specific Tuesday morning, represented the largest financial transaction of her professional life. The contract on the table was 63 pages long. Marcus had reviewed it. His team of 4 associates had reviewed it. An external counsel firm had reviewed it. Everyone had agreed. It was solid, it was clean, it was ready. Victoria turned from the window. "All right," she said. "Let's do this." The service elevator on the west side of Hargrove Tower was slower than the main elevators by about 45 seconds, and it smelled like motor oil and the ghost of 1,000 lunches eaten in transit. Daniel Whitfield had taken it so many times over the past 4 years that he had memorized every scratch on the inside of the doors. The long diagonal gouge near the bottom left corner from the time someone had tried to move a refrigerator-sized equipment crate without padding. The cluster of small dents at shoulder height, origin unknown. A faded sticker in the upper corner, a cartoon wrench with a thumbs up that a previous technician had left years before Daniel's time, and that nobody had ever bothered to remove. He knew the rhythm of this building the way musicians knew the rhythm of their instrument. He knew which circuit breakers ran hot in summer, which HVAC units developed a specific rattle when the temperature differential outside hit a certain threshold, which floors had been renovated in the past 2 years, and which ones were running on original electrical infrastructure would at some point become a more pressing problem than it currently was. He had written 3 maintenance advisories about that last issue. The first 2 had been filed and not acted upon. The third one, 6 months ago, had finally gotten a budget allocation, which meant that sometime in the next fiscal quarter, someone would begin the process of planning the work. That was how it went. You identified the problem. You documented it. You waited. He pressed the button for 43 and leaned back against the railing, eyes closed for a moment, running through the morning's work order in his head. Panel C7 inches. The executive conference suite had been throwing a fault signal since yesterday afternoon. Intermittent, not critical, but enough to flag a maintenance request. He had his diagnostic kit, his multimeter, a replacement fuse block in case the original was failing, and his 9-year-old son standing approximately 2 1/2 feet to his left. "Dad," Ethan said. "Yeah, you said 15 minutes. Last time you said 15 minutes, it was 58. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at his son. Ethan was small for his age, slight-framed, with Daniel's own dark eyes, and the kind of serious expression that people sometimes found unsettling in a child. He was wearing a navy blue hoodie with a small hole near the left cuff that he absolutely refused to let Daniel throw away. And he was carrying a paperback book about cryptographic logic puzzles that he had already read twice. He had a second book in his backpack, something about number theory, in case he finished the first one. "It'll be 15 minutes, Daniel said. "You always say that. And sometimes I'm right. The ratio is not in your favor." Daniel looked at his son for a moment. "Have you been tracking it?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "Maybe." The elevator opened on 43. The arrangement had been made with building management 3 weeks ago when Ethan's school had a professional development day, and Daniel couldn't get the time off, and his usual backup, his neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, was visiting her daughter in Philadelphia. The building's facilities director, a patient woman named Sandra Oakes, had reluctantly agreed that Ethan could accompany Daniel on low-priority service calls as long as he stayed quiet, stayed out of the way, and touched absolutely nothing. Ethan had, so far, adhered to 2 of these 3 conditions. Daniel led them down the corridor toward the conference suite, toolbox in one hand, service order in the other. The hallway outside the executive floor had that particular silence of a place where very important things were about to happen and everyone involved was pretending to be relaxed about it. He knocked twice on the secondary access door, the maintenance entry, separate from the main conference room entrance, and a harried-looking young man in a white shirt waved him through. "Fast as you can," the young man said. "The meeting starts in 10 minutes. Panels on the north wall, right?" Daniel said. "Behind the credenza. Don't move anything." Daniel nodded. Ethan followed him through the door. The conference room was large, large enough that the long mahogany table at its center felt almost modest inside it. The ceiling was high and coffered. The windows ran floor to ceiling along the south face, and the morning light came through cleanly, filling the space with the kind of gray-white luminescence that made everything look expensive. Around the table, people were arranging documents and opening laptops and speaking in low voices. A woman stood near the window with her back to the room. Ethan stopped walking. Daniel turned. "Keep moving." "Who's that?" Ethan asked quietly. "I don't know. Come on." The electrical panel was indeed behind the credenza on the north wall, a long, low piece of furniture in dark walnut, currently covered with stacked document binders and a row of water glasses. Daniel set his toolbox down, opened the panel cover carefully, and clipped his diagnostic meter to the circuit leads. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, opened his book, and appeared to all outward appearances to be reading. He was not reading, he was watching. The thing about Ethan Whitfield was that his brain had never quite learned to ignore things the way most people's brains did. Other people walked into a room and registered table, chairs, people, light. Their minds performed a kind of automatic triage, deciding what mattered and discarding everything else. It was efficient. It was necessary. It was how you got through the day without being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information that the world was constantly producing. Ethan's brain didn't do that. Ethan's brain registered the particular angle at which the blinds were set, the water ring on the second glass from the left, the fact that two of the men on one side of the table were wearing watches that looked identical, the way the woman near the window was holding her coffee cup with both hands, even though she wasn't drinking from it, the 3-in stack of paper at the center of the table that everyone kept glancing at without appearing to look at it directly. His teachers called it exceptional attention to detail. One of them, in a parent-teacher conference the previous spring, had used the phrase possibly hyper-focused. His father called it the thing Ethan does. Ethan called it nothing. It was just how everything worked. He watched the room settle. The woman at the window turned around, and Ethan revised his earlier assessment of important person upward to person. Everyone in this room is slightly afraid of. She was younger than most of the people at the table, and she held herself very straight, and when she said, "Let's do this," the entire room shifted fractionally in her direction, like plants turning toward a light source. The document was passed around. Several people signed pages quickly, in the way of people who had already done their review, and were now doing the formality of it. Then it was placed at the position directly in front of the woman, Miss Hale. One of the men had called her, and a pen was set beside it. Her lawyer said something about the timeline for capital transfer. Miss Hale picked up the pen and Ethan saw it. He almost didn't. The document was across the room. He was 9 years old, sitting on the floor behind a credenza, and the relevant section was on what appeared to be page 41 of a 63-page contract, rendered in a font that was, even from a distance, noticeably smaller than the body text surrounding it. But his brain didn't let him not see it. It was the spacing that caught him first, a barely there inconsistency, a line that was set infinitesimally tighter than the lines around it, as if it had been inserted from a different document and the spacing had never been fully corrected. Then, the weight of the font, then, as he strained to parse the actual words from across the room, transfer of intellectual property rights and ownership interest shall vest in the acquiring party no later than 12 months following. Ethan closed his book. "Dad," he said very quietly. Daniel was focused on the circuit panel, almost done. "Dad." Something in his tone made Daniel look over. Ethan wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the table, at the document, at the pen in Miss Hale's hand. "Don't sign that," Ethan said. He hadn't meant it to come out loud. He had meant it for his father. But in the particular silence of a room where everyone was holding their breath, it came out very clearly into the air. Victoria's pen stopped. Not because she processed the words immediately. She didn't. It was more that the unexpectedness of a child's voice in a room where there was supposed to be no child created a half-second of pure cognitive interruption. Her hand paused, her head turned. The rest of the room reacted in a more typical sequence. First, confused silence. Then the slow, disbelieving turn of several heads toward the north wall, where a young boy was now standing up from behind the credenza, still holding a book, looking at Victoria with an expression of complete seriousness. Then laughter. Not cruel laughter, mostly just the bewildered release of tension. Elliot Branson let out a short bark of amusement. One of the junior associates covered her mouth. Even Marcus Webb, who did not typically laugh in professional settings, allowed himself a small, indulgent smile. Then, the man who had let Daniel into the room was moving across the floor, expression horrified. Then, Daniel himself was on his feet, face flushed, reaching for Ethan's shoulder. "I'm so sorry. He wasn't Ethan. Come on. Who is that child?" Branson said, not unkindly, with the amused tone of a man encountering a minor absurdity. Maintenance. Someone said, the tech brought him. Dad, listen. Ethan said, not moving. He wasn't being stubborn, or rather, he was being stubborn, but only in the specific way that happened when his brain had identified something that felt structurally wrong and could not be talked down from it. There's a clause on page 41 in the small font. Ethan. Daniel said, I saw it from here. The font is different. The spacing is different. And it says something about IP transfer. Branson was still smiling, but the smile had changed quality, slightly less amused, more fixed. Your boy reads contracts at a distance? He reads everything at a distance. Daniel said in a tone that contained multitudes. I'm genuinely sorry about this. He had Ethan's arm now. We're going. Wait, it was Victoria's voice, not loud, but it had the specific quality of a word that ended motion. Everyone stopped. She was looking at Ethan. Not the way you looked at a child who had interrupted your meeting, the way you looked at something unexpected that had just entered your field of vision, and you weren't yet sure what to do with it. Page 41, she said. Yes, Ethan said. Toward the bottom, the smaller text, Marcus, Victoria said. Victoria, this is page 41. Marcus Webb did not rush. That would have been beneath him. He turned to page 41 with the deliberate composure of a man who had been practicing composure for 6 decades and was very good at it. He found the section in question in approximately 4 seconds. His face did not change. Victoria had known Marcus for 9 years, and she had learned to read the very subtle register of changes that his face underwent when something was wrong. A fractional tightening around his eyes, a slight forward movement of his jaw. She saw both of those things now. The room was very quiet. Marcus, she said. He looked up. Give me a moment. He read. He turned the page. He turned back. He set the document down, picked up his pen, and drew a thin line in the margin beside a specific passage. Then he looked at Branson. Elliot, he said, I'd like you to walk me through section 14, 7C, subclause 2. Branson's smile was now entirely architectural. It existed as a structural feature of his face, bearing no relationship to any actual emotion. That's standard investment language. It's in every Corvin Capital agreement. It is not standard language. Marcus said, it is not in agreements I have reviewed, and I would like you to explain what you understand it to mean. It's a technical protection clause. It protects both parties' intellectual property during the integration phase. It transfers full ownership of Hale Integrated's core technology platform to Corvin Capital 12 months following close. Marcus said, it does not protect both parties. It transfers Victoria's primary asset to you. The room did something rooms don't often do. It went cold. Not metaphorically, or not entirely metaphorically. It felt as if the air temperature had dropped 2 degrees. Victoria set the pen down on the table, very carefully, very precisely. The way you set something down when you are using the act of setting it down to give yourself time to feel something and not show it. Is that accurate? She said. It was not a question. Branson was saying something. Words were happening. His colleagues were also producing words. Someone used the phrase, clerical error. And someone else used the phrase, misunderstanding. And someone said the intent was never, but Victoria was not listening to the words. She was listening to the specific frequency of men who had been caught. She had heard that frequency before. She knew it by heart. She looked at the page. There it was. 27 words in a font that was perhaps 3/4 the size of the surrounding text, embedded in a section titled Integration Protocols and Technology Governance. 3 pages after a long passage about data security standards that had been designed, she now understood, to blur the eye and soften the attention of anyone reading at that point in a 63-page document after a long morning of document review. 27 words, and they would have taken everything she had built. She looked up at Ethan. He was still standing beside his father, book tucked under one arm, watching her with those serious dark eyes. He looked the way he had probably looked when he first noticed the inconsistency. Not triumphant, not excited, just the expression of someone who had identified a problem and reported it, the way you reported a fault code on an electrical panel. How? She said. From there, the font spacing, he said. It was tighter than the rest of the page, and then I could see the different weight. It was slightly lighter. So, I tried to read it. You tried to read a contract clause from 30 feet away. 28, he said. I measured. I estimated. Victoria looked at Daniel. Daniel's face had the expression of a man who had been waiting for approximately 9 years for this exact situation to arise and had still not fully prepared for it. I'm sorry, Daniel said reflexively. Stop apologizing, Victoria said. She looked back at Ethan. How old are you? 9, Ethan said. In 2 months. 9? She repeated. Yes, the next 45 minutes were controlled chaos. Branson tried twice to recover the situation. His first attempt involved a lengthy explanation of standard investment protection clauses and the concept of mutual IP governance, which Marcus dismantled in approximately 90 seconds. His second attempt involved suggesting that the entire section had been inserted by a junior paralegal as a placeholder and had never been intended to survive final review, which might have been credible if not for the fact that it was formatted differently from the surrounding text in a way that suggested deliberate insertion rather than accidental carry-through. The woman from Corvin, whose name Victoria had finally determined was Renata Foyle, said nothing during either attempt. She was the quietest person in the room, which Victoria found interesting because quiet in that kind of situation was either the stillness of innocence or the stillness of someone who had already decided what they were going to do next. Victoria excused herself twice, once to call her external legal team and once to call the only board member she trusted without reservation, a woman named Dolores Crane, who had been in the technology investment space for 30 years and whose opinion Victoria valued above almost anyone else's. Dolores said, "Pull out." Victoria said, "I know." Dolores said, "Today, don't let them reframe it. You pull out today and you control the narrative." Victoria said, "I know." She came back into the room and told them, "I'm terminating this negotiation," she said, "effective immediately. My legal team will be in contact with yours regarding the documentation." Branson started to speak. Victoria looked at him and he stopped. "I don't have anything else to say to you in this room," she said. "Please, take your documents." After they left, which they did with the specific shuffling awkwardness of people who had been caught and knew it and were recalibrating quickly, the room was much quieter. Marcus closed his portfolio. "I should have caught that." "Yes," Victoria said. "I'm sorry. I know." She paused. "I'm not dismissing you, Marcus, but I need you to understand that this was a significant failure." "I understand." "Good." She turned. Daniel was packing up his toolbox. The diagnostic on the electrical panel had, apparently, been completed at some point during the preceding chaos. The fault light on the credenza's hidden panel strip was no longer blinking. Ethan was sitting on the floor again with his book, though he was not reading it. "Ethan," Victoria said. He looked up. "Will you show me exactly what you saw?" He stood up, walked to the table, and pointed to page 41 without touching the document. His finger hovered over a small block of text that, now that Victoria was looking for it, was plainly different from everything around it. It was like one of those hidden object puzzles, invisible until the instant you saw it, and then you couldn't unsee it. "The spacing between the lines here," Ethan said, pointing. "It's about 1 instead of 1, 15, and the characters are thinner. It's like somebody copied it from a different document, and the styles didn't match exactly." Marcus, who had come to look over her shoulder, made a sound she had never heard him make before. It was the sound of a very experienced professional encountering something humbling. "He's right," Marcus said quietly. "The leading is different. I should have." He stopped himself. "How do you know about leading?" Victoria asked Ethan. "My dad does project documentation sometimes. I help format it. Leading is the space between lines. It comes from the old typesetting thing where they used actual lead strips." He paused. "I read about it." "Of course you did," she said. It was Sandra Oakes, the facilities director, who had come up when someone reported a prolonged maintenance visit in an executive conference room, who said it first in the hallway outside in a quiet voice that was trying to be diplomatic. "Miss Hale, I have to raise the possibility, given the timing, that there might have been a coordinated—" "You're asking if the boy was planted," Victoria said. Sandra had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It's a standard security question." "It's a reasonable question," Victoria said. She looked at Daniel, who was standing in the hallway with Ethan beside him, having clearly heard every word. His expression was complicated, the particular combination of pride and weariness that she would later come to recognize as his default setting. "How long have you worked in this building?" 4 years and 3 months, Daniel said. "How long has Corvin Capital been on our potential investor list?" I don't know anything about your investor list." "Of course you don't." She looked at Sandra. "Pull his employment records. Pull the access logs for today. If there's any evidence of a prior relationship with anyone at Corvin Capital, I want to know. But I'm telling you right now that there isn't. You can't know that for certain." "I can make a reasonable assessment," Victoria said, "based on the fact that the man is standing here looking at me like someone who had no idea this morning was going to go the way it did. And his kid is standing next to him with a book about cryptographic logic puzzles." She glanced at the cover. "Second edition. You've read it twice." Ethan looked slightly startled that she had noticed. "Yeah. What's your favorite puzzle type?" "Hash functions," he said without hesitation, "because you can always check your answer." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I'll pull the records." Victoria nodded. "Do that." She looked at Daniel. "Stay, please. I'd like to talk to you when she's done." Daniel opened his mouth. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Victoria said. "I'd just like to talk to you." Daniel looked at her for a moment longer than strictly necessary. The expression on his face was the one she'd seen in the hallway, measured, careful. The expression of a man who had learned that generosity from strangers sometimes had a structure underneath it. "All right," he said finally. Ethan, beside him, was already looking at the sculpture on the credenza. His crisis was over. His father's was being processed. His brain had moved on to the next available object of interest. The records came back clean. Daniel Whitfield had worked in Hargrove Towers facilities and maintenance division for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Prior to that, he had been a senior systems engineer at a mid-sized tech infrastructure firm called Delsert Technologies for 6 years. Prior to that, he had completed degree in electrical engineering with a concentration in systems architecture from Penn State, graduating in the top 8% of his class. His performance reviews at Delsort were uniformly strong through year 5. Year 6 showed increasing leave requests, which aligned in the records with his wife's diagnosis. His resignation letter had cited family health circumstances requiring schedule flexibility. There was nothing unusual about it. It was the kind of letter that got filed in HR and forgotten, the paperwork of a life being quietly rerouted. His performance reviews at Hargrove were also strong, with a consistent note from the facilities director about his reliability and his habit of submitting written documentation on structural issues that others might have reported verbally or not at all. There was no connection to Corvin Capital. There was no connection to Elliot Branson. There was no connection to anyone involved in the deal beyond the service order that had sent him to the 43rd floor that morning. Sandra reported this to Victoria in her office, and Victoria said, "I know," in the same tone she'd used earlier with Dolores, and Sandra left. Then she asked her assistant to bring Daniel and Ethan in. They came in with the particular body language of people who had not been in a CEO's office before, or in Daniel's case, people who had not been in a CEO's office for a long time. He sat very straight. Ethan sat the same way, mirroring his father's posture almost exactly, and looked around the office with the frank observational gaze that Victoria was beginning to understand was just how he looked at everything. "You are an engineer," she said to Daniel. "Delsert Technologies. You looked me up. I always look people up. Why did you leave?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "My wife got sick. When she was diagnosed, I needed flexibility that a senior position couldn't give me. The facilities work was," he paused, choosing words, "it was flexible. I could bring Ethan if I needed to. I could move shifts around. She passed 3 years ago." Victoria held that for a moment. "And you've been here since?" "Yes." "You didn't try to go back to engineering?" He looked at her. Not with resentment, more with the weary patience of someone who has answered a version of this question many times, mostly from well-meaning people who assumed the answer was simple. It's not just about the job. It's the hours, the travel, the expectation that you're always available. He stopped again. Ethan needs a parent who's actually there, not theoretically there. Victoria looked at Ethan, who was examining a small glass sculpture on the corner of her desk with intense focus. "What school does he go to?" Grover Cleveland Elementary, in Queens. He's been tested? He tested into 2 programs. We couldn't afford the program fees. Daniel's voice was even. I know how that sounds, but the enrichment programs, the private assessments, the specialized schools, none of that is covered by anything. And I'm making $46,000 a year. Victoria didn't say anything for a moment. I'm not here asking for anything, Daniel said. I want you to know that. He saw something that seemed wrong to him, and he said something. That's how he is. I'm not leveraging it. I know you're not, Victoria said. That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you. She didn't make it that day. That was a decision she made consciously because she was aware that making it that day immediately, in the flush of gratitude and adrenaline, hours after a man's child had essentially saved her company, would have felt like payment, like a transaction, like something that came with conditions embedded in fine print, which was a dynamic she was currently feeling sensitive about. She also knew, because she was honest with herself about this kind of thing, that gratitude made for poor long-term decision-making. She had seen it before, a moment of crisis, a rescue, an immediate response that felt definitive and later turned out to have been impulsive. She did not want to offer Daniel Whitfield a job and fund his son's education because she owed him something. She wanted to do it because it was a sound decision on its own merits. That required a few days' distance and a clear head. She spent those days reading Delsert Technologies' public documentation, their infrastructure rebuilds, their published case studies, any conference appearances by their technical team from the years Daniel would have been a senior engineer. She found his name 3 times. Once in an internal case study that had been made public on Delsort's website as lead engineer on a data migration project, twice in the acknowledgments of 2 technical papers published by colleagues who had cited his contributions to methodology. The work was good, the thinking was precise. The kind of precise that didn't degrade with disuse, she thought, because it came from how someone was built, rather than from what they had practiced recently. Then she asked, carefully and without pressure, if Daniel would be willing to meet with her again, professionally. She had a specific reason for asking. He looked at her with the careful expression of someone trying to determine whether this was an ordinary sentence or a sentence that had other clauses hidden in it. For what purpose, he said. I'm in the process of building out a systems infrastructure team. The person leading it left in February. I've been interviewing candidates for the past 6 weeks and haven't found anyone who meets the technical requirements I need. I haven't been in that space for 4 years. I know. I'd like to talk to you about whether that gap is bridgeable. That's all. She looked at him. No obligations, no pressure. If you'd rather not, we can shake hands and that's the end of it. He thought about it for a moment. All right, he said. We can talk. She stood to shake his hand and then looked down at Ethan, who had finished examining the glass sculpture and was now looking up at her with those serious dark eyes. Ethan, she said. Yeah, thank you. He considered this, the way he considered most things directly, without deflection. You're not mad? No. Some people would be mad. Some people, Victoria said, would have just signed the paper. The cafeteria at the Halloran School for Advanced Studies was louder at lunchtime than Ethan had initially expected. He was still adjusting to the noise. At Grover Cleveland, lunch had been a more manageable kind of loud. The specific chaos of a school where most of the kids had grown up in the same neighborhood, and the noise had a familiar texture. Here, the sound was different, more